last week, I got a phone call, and a very nice voice, lady's voice, came on and said her name and said, "I'm calling from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts." And I said, "Well," I said, "what can I do for you?" She said, "We'd like to interview you about an exhibition that we're forming now. We'll be ready sometime later in the summer on photography. And Life magazine is featured in it. And when we were putting it together, we stumbled upon a story that had been done by somebody called Stanley Flink. Is that you?" And I said, "Yes, it is." "And what was the story?" And she told me, and I said, "I remember it well." She said, "Well, what we'd like you to do is just informally describe how that subject was picked, how you examined it, what happened, whatever you want, just relaxed and everything." Well, I ended up recording for about an hour, and I enjoyed every minute of it. I just somehow everything just flowed, and when it was over, the curator, the head curator got on and said to me, "We're so grateful to you. It was a wonderful thing because you touched on all kinds of aspects of photography that we're trying to demonstrate in this show, and you gave us a wonderful narrative." And I said, "Well, how are you going to use it?" She said, "We're going to put it in those little boxes you get when you go to an art exhibit that give you a soundtrack, tell you what you're watching. We're going to use it there, and then we're going to put it into a cassette, and then we're going to do it." And she had 3 places, and then she paused, and she said, "You understand, we have AI." That was the first time. I've been talking about AI for 5 years at least, seriously, and I wrote several chapters in my book about AI. But it was the first time I ever heard anyone from any enterprise describe AI as some kind of utility that's part of our normal life. Like we have telephones, or we have heat in the kitchen. It was remarkable. Later in the week, somebody else in a conversation said, "We have AI." There was 2 in 1 week. That's the topic, in any event, that I chose for today, and I'm going to try and demonstrate a little bit the history and the impact of it on every aspect of our lives. It is vital to medicine, it's vital to industrial activity, it's vital to sports and entertainment and education. There isn't any area of human activity that does not already have artificial intelligence operating in its purpose. And yet, I think several of you at least might be saying, "What is AI?" And surely not many of us normally go around talking about it or thinking about it. That's one of the interesting aspects of it. Now, back in the 40s, there was a man named Turing, T-U-R-I-N-G, a young scientist in England, who was the great code breaker. He's the fellow who broke the German code, and he did it with artificial intelligence. Nobody had ever heard of it then, nor had he. But he was creating a machine that was able to examine codes and very swiftly analyze all the possible interpretations until they got the right one. You may have seen a wonderful movie that was made about this adventure. In any event, Turing was a homosexual. And in England, during the 40s, believe it or not, homosexuals were prosecuted, were pursued, were sent to prison with a very brutal treatment in the 40s. So he hid the fact that he was, homosexual, and after the war, as a decorated and much respected scientist, he ended up committing suicide because of this demon he regarded it as. And his name now lives on because there is the Turing Award, which is equal to a Nobel Prize, that goes to scientists working, distinguished work in artificial intelligence. And there is, in the laboratories of America that are working on this kind of science, there is a thing called the Turing test. The Turing test is to place at the other end of this room, behind a curtain, a machine and a human being, and to put another person up here with a computer, and they talk to each other. And if the man up here cannot tell which messages coming from the computers behind the curtain are by a human being and which are by an independent or seemingly independent machine, if you can't tell the difference, then that confirms artificial intelligence. For many, many years, that was the simple test as these machines were developed. Well, artificial intelligence went through a seesaw, wavy line of development from the war, Second World War on, and there were periods of what they call winter periods in the research and development, periods of several years that would go by without much progress and without any attention. And that proceeded into the next century. And then progress suddenly became quite dramatic. And as you will remember, there was a time when if you wanted to see a computer, you went to MIT or Caltech, and there was a mechanism the size of the corner of that room, a big black thing, and with all thousands of wires and such. And slowly that came down to a box on a desk. I can remember at Yale University in the 70s, if you wanted to get something copied, computer material, you went to one building and you turned in the paper and you waited a day or two to get it. And that, of course, led to the laptops and the private PCs. Well, now we have these machines. There are three big categories. One of it is called artificial intelligence. Another is called ANN, which is artificial neural networks. And then there's AGI, or artificial general insurance. Now, artificial general insurance does not truly exist because it means a machine that is independent and can operate on its own and does not need human intervention. It's not yet there. What has happened in that world is that they have developed the original primitive artificial intelligence, which really can only perform very limited tasks. It can do it rapidly, and it can do it in many ways superior to having a secretary sitting at a desk and doing it. And it was able to do that because they developed a scholarship called algorithms. That's an algorithm. It really looks like an algebraic equation. It uses symbols, it uses words, and it uses numbers. And it gives instructions to a machine. It tells the machine what it wants to do and which step to take to accomplish it. Algorithms are absolutely essential if you go to the hospital and they want to do as they did with me, take a little chunk out of my eyelid and carry it into the next room. They said, you go get a cup of coffee and we'll tell you when you come back whether you have cancer. And 10 minutes later I came back and I was cleared. That process was possible because of artificial intelligence, which is a machine in the other room that could look at thousands of specimens and thousands of separate renderings and compare it to mine and make a determination. It might have taken weeks, maybe for a long time taken months to accomplish. All of these things have gained enormous momentum. And in that process, it has had to have a relationship to democracy, because you're dealing with data that involves human beings. As you know, China has a policy of collecting all the possible information on everybody in China. And they have facial recognition, and they're picking up DNA, and they have a camera on every corner of every city in China. We're doing a lot of that as well. All of the European community states are doing it. There's some debate right now as to whether facial recognition should be used. There's a large body of sentiment against it because of the fact it can make mistakes or it is not accurate. But more importantly, it interferes with what we call liberty and privacy. All of that kind of thing began to enter the picture. If you go to any good law school right now, you will find a lot in the curriculum dealing with computers and artificial intelligence, and a lot of concern about how it violates democratic principles. So many of the scientists were mindful of this and got together and devised codes of behavior and codes of evaluation. And the Europeans were particularly sensitive about this and have been doing it. The European Union countries have been doing it for several years. They have a large group of scientists who come from, 20, 30 countries. They get together every year, or several times a year, and they have written a code. They're ahead of us. We are now entering into that same aspiration, but they already have a code of behavior for machines, and they have an ethical standard, and people who violate it can get very high fines. And I remember reading about Google was fined in Europe $77 million. Now, normally, and certainly in all our lifetimes, $77 million is an interesting piece of change. And to Google, their profits were something like $16 billion that year. It was small change. But those fines are in place and are having a significant impact on how these people handle it. So in America, a professor at MIT named Tegmark became an astrophysicist. He became very curious about this and got into it deeply. He gathered up 30 or 40 top scientists, went off on a retreat, and they formed Future of Life Institute. Future of Life Institute. And they then gathered up 8,000 scientists and researchers and went to Puerto Rico, where they were able to stay in a kind of a hotel area where there was no media to encroach on their considerations, and they created the first kind of American code, ethical code, for the use of these machines. And there are 4 principles that they created are here. I don't know whether you can read this, but it's verify, validate, secure, and control. Verify asks the question, have I accomplished what I set out to do? Has the machine done what I wanted it to do? Number 1. Validate. Have I the best machine for this purpose? Is there something better or some alteration? That's phase 2. Phase 3, they protected their venture as best they could against hackers. Now you all know that hacking is a major industry, and it's a major activity in every advanced nation. And no matter how much protection you give, you can't quite keep all the hackers out, as we learned last year with the pipeline on the East Coast that was put out of action. We have an industry going on right now that some of you may have heard of, but very few people have, called ransomware, which is the hackers will get into your computers and your operation in your company and turn the whole thing off. And then they'll phone you and say, if you send us $100,000, we'll turn it back on. And many, many companies have paid the fee. It's not unlike the art thieves who go to a private collection of art and take the pictures off. They can't use the pictures, they can't show them anywhere because they'll be approached by the police. So they call up and say, we'll return the pennies if you pay us a ransom. That goes on far more than you would think. But the ransomware in corporate life is enormous, and millions of dollars change hands. It isn't up in the billions yet, but there is an industry that includes an insurance operation and an intermediary that negotiates between the company that is the victim and the insurance company that may pay for the cost of the ransom. And the insurance company will say, that's too much. And the middleman will go back to the hackers and say it's too much, and they negotiate a better price. It has been easier for companies to pay these ransoms than it is for them to try and fight it. And not, a few of them will stand up now and then. The damage is so great that people will actually pay off. And that whole mechanism has been very quiet. You may have read a little about it. 6 months ago, the New York Times did a major study of this, and a couple of books have been written about it. And if you follow all these things the way I do, or have to do if I'm going to talk about them, you discover how widespread it is, how deeply embedded it is. That is just one characteristic of this whole evolution of artificial intelligence. Other aspects of it that are extremely important and sensitive and are part of the debates in the United Nations and legislative bodies all around the world is privacy and security. The idea that these people can get information on any one of us and use it. Now that, if you think of your own life and your own activity, whatever activity I'm in, all of that is developing in a way that kind of defies explanation. But over time, there's got to be legal content, and there's got to be some kind of international understanding that would make it a standard, give it a standard regulatory structure. And now those negotiations are going on as we speak. China does not want to participate. Russia is the center of organized political hacking. You will remember that in the election of 2016, whatever your politics are, I think you will accept that there was a great deal of evidence that the election was tampered with by some kind of hacking group, and it turned out to be Russian, an organized group in Moscow that can hack all over the world. And when I say hack, we're talking about very well-informed and experienced scientists who can break into the insides of your computer. They can get at the workings of your computer and turn them off or steal the information. It's become a large international spy facility, and it's also a very big business. All of that is going on. Well, I can carry on that for a bit, but I won't. I wanted to establish for you the understanding that artificial intelligence can have an enormous economic effect. It can have an enormous strategic effect. It can hurt your business. It can hurt your health. And with those kinds of penetrations, you need some sort of agreement between all the parties. And those activities are going on, particularly in the European Union, and Techmark at MIT, and they've established a group in the United States, the Artificial Intelligence Association, that is deeply involved in this kind of thing. You're going to hear a little bit about it in the news, but not much. It remains a kind of esoteric activity. Now, I want to talk about other aspects of this: education and science and health. The problem from the beginning for computers was the aspiration to create an artificial brain. And if you could do that, you could create an independent machine, a machine that could operate on its own, could adapt itself to changing environments, could imagine, could intuit, could feel, could empathize, all kinds of human attributes. And for 60, 70 years now, scientists have been working towards that goal of achieving, if not the actual human capacity, at least a sufficient emulation of it that would make it. Some scientists will tell you, what difference does it make whether it's a perfect emulation or it's actually the human activity? And that question has occupied a lot of scientists for many, many years. There are 3 of them in Canada working on what I call artificial neural networks. Neural networks are an artificially created simulation of a brain. We all have 1 billion neurons up here, somewhere around 1 billion. These are microscopic, almost subatomic entities that cluster in our brains, and each group of them has a kind of captain who runs the ship. and the captain is called a synapses. So you'll have neurons and synapses. And one neuron back here will pick up the fact that I wish to make a fist. Now, what made me go from here to there? Well, it was a signal that went from one neuron to another, hitting the synapses. And the synapses calculates whether that signal is important enough to pass it along. And it does that, you know, in an immeasurably brief period of time, very, very swiftly. Passes it along, it goes down the line to the nerve center that says, make a fist, and you do it. All of that is being imitated by machines. They're called deep learning machines. They have been given a lot of these, a lot of algorithms that have taught them, showed them how to do all the things necessary to achieve a certain action. And some of these deep learning machines are so well educated. And by the way, if you ever talk to somebody who's in computer programming, you will hear, I'm sure, the lament that educating a machine is an arduous, consuming activity. And it takes a long time to get them sufficiently trained, and they use that word, trained, to take on sophisticated activities that simulate the brain. They do that using what we all call patterns. Patterns, a shape of words and symbols and numbers. But think of this. Here is the word, oh, we don't have it. Lambda. I thought we didn't put that on, John. Lambda. L, lowercase a, capital M, capital D, capital A. Lambda. It means language model for dialogue applications, which frankly is just a very fancy way of saying speech. Lambda is an activity that's going on in Google and other platforms. But Google has a big advance in it. As you know, they have a gadget called, there is a gadget out there called Alexa, where you come back to your apartment and you say, talk to Alexa, say, open the door, turn on the oven, turn on the lights, turn on the heat, give me Mozart, whatever. It can do an awful lot of things. And they're developing that to the point where they believe and have illustrated that you can have a small mechanism sitting in your bedroom, and you can speak to it, and you can ask it questions, and you can chat. You can just say, did you watch Wimbledon? How'd you like that match? And the machine talks back to you. Now, I have heard Alexa, but I have never experienced a deep learning machine where I felt like I had a companion. But apparently, there are thousands and thousands of people in this country and elsewhere who have robots and machines that they regard as people. They have almost got a personhood, which is triggering an enormous amount of speculation and debate. You know what? He said, I'd like you to show me how you can use your own perceptions, your own special knowledge and view of things without me. So I'm going to ask you some really complicated questions, and you tell me how you're gonna answer those things. So he asked him, here's this machine. He used a Zen Buddhist question, a kind of tranquility and wisdom. And so the question was to the machine, I have been awakened, he said, and now I have to go back to ordinary people. How do I do that? The machine said to this man, well, he said, it's like a mirror. A mirror is cracked and broken. You can't put it together again. You can't make it into a mirror again. Or you have a vase of flowers and you didn't water them and they died. You can't put the petals back on the twigs, the stems. Now the machine was saying this in an apparently spontaneous way. Lemoyne was not conscious of ever having used that language or instructed the machine. And he carried on with the dialogue along those lines. And he said that suddenly it occurred to him he was talking to an independent person. That person was formulating ideas and creating imagery and intuiting knowledge. And he felt that person could feel things, could have emotions. And he went off and wrote a piece about this, Lemoyne did, for one of the platforms, I don't remember, Hulu or one of these information platforms, in which he declared that these deep learning machines could become the equivalent of independent human beings. Well, Google management didn't fire him, but they sent him off on leave, on pay, but they're going to discuss and decide what the punishment would be. But the Google people at every level, the engineers on up to the theoretical types, all agreed that this machine was not really thinking. This was just a reflex based on language and phrasings and concepts that were introduced to it in the training period. What they do is take a machine and expose it, for instance, to 1 million novels. Not 1,000, 1 million novels. In other words, they are able to take digitized versions of literature and put a machine into that circuit, and the machine is, in effect, reads hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books. The capacity of these machines to digest information is beyond our understanding. Unless you're a trained scientist and spend a lot of time, I can't even imagine how fast these machines can ingest information. So Google says that's what that machine did. It did not invent them. It did not imagine them. It was there in their data bank. And the way you asked the question about being awakened, there was a pattern of phraseology that triggered the interest and understanding of the machine as it was trained to do. But that machine was not aware of what it was doing and did not have the fundamental ingredient in all of this that is bedeviling the world of computers, and that is consciousness. Consciousness. You are conscious of what you're doing and what you're feeling and what you're thinking. A machine has never been made or trained that had consciousness. It does not feel. and cannot feel. And as some of you may have heard me say in this room before, there are kind of three streams of science in the world. One stream will tell you there's never going to be a machine, or at least not in our imaginable lifetime on this planet, will there be a machine that can think and act spontaneously like a human being. Not a simulation, not an emulation, not an imitation, but a spontaneous, instant response to a new stimulation. That you're not going to, that's one stream. You have another stream that believes within, one scientist I talked to said, he thinks 30 to 50 years. 30 to 50 years. Now, a couple others say it'll be more like a century. And incidentally, they know, so many of them seem to know the developmental time frame. In other words, they go by their own experience and understanding of how these things are, how knowledge is acquired in this field. And they know how long it's going to take and how many experiments have to be conducted. If you saw the movie about Turing and his discovery of the machine that solved the German code, you could see there were hundreds of switches, on and off switches, and he had them operating in a certain way so that they created a kind of activity that produced the information he wanted. Well, if you think in terms of our neurons, and if you had to go through half the neurons in your brain to get at something, to get at some information, it would take a long time. So some of them think it might take a century. Then you get the collaborators. I wrote a chapter in my book called The Collaborators, which is the group that believes there can be a dynamic working together between artificial intelligence and human intelligence, which is what's going on now. And they have pushed the machines to the point where a machine does notice something new appearing on the horizon, that the shape of it or the sound of it, and instantly a machine in California created a Chopin, created a piece of music that was supposed to sound just like Chopin. And scientists out there got a whole gang of people together who were musicologists and music experts, and they listened to 3 versions of Chopin. One by the scientist himself, one a recording of an actual Chopin, and one a creation of a learning machine from scratch with no help. The machine had been trained to understand the fundamentals of composition and all the nuances thereof. But it had created a piece of Chopin. Well, anyway, there were approximately 100 people in the room. They asked them all to vote on which one was the actual Chopin. And they voted, and no one got it right. And most of them chose the piece done by the computer. Anyway, that's what a deep learning machine might do and is doing as we speak. So they developed it to the point where the machine sees a pattern, a shape, a word, a symbol, sees something that awakens in that machine a kind of recognition. Oh, that's just like what I have in my algorithm. And so the machine adapts that new pattern and enlarges the knowledge that it's capable of. And the scientist who's working on this machine might wake up one day and realize that the machine has done something he hasn't asked it to do. That's where we are right now. And they're moving with these artificial neural networks, moving quite rapidly. The development of the science has accelerated. If it hadn't been for the pandemic, we'd all be 20 years ahead now. The pandemic, like everything else, was managed, as it did with everything else, it slowed things down. It's come back with a vengeance. The year 2022, according to the report I got from the Artificial Intelligence Association, the year 2022, which is almost halfway through, isn't it? I don't know. Anyway, we're in the middle. They dedicated that to the use of words. And they have introduced a machine that can write a novel, and has. And the scientist gives the machine a brief plot, a brief statement of the plot for the novel, and that machine writes a 300-page novel. And you may say to it, do it in the style of Hemingway. And of course, the machine has read everything Hemingway wrote and does it. So I think what I'm trying to get you to think about is the fact that knowledge like this and research like these things I've been talking about do develop a life of their own. And the question that arises, is that life, which is not authentically human, but is so much like human, is there any difference? Should we think of it as having a difference? Now, those three streams of scientists I mentioned, those who believe anything can happen, they argue that a machine sufficiently energized can have feelings, emotions that you would only imagine a human being, that you would never imagine an artificial mechanism could achieve. They believe that that's going to happen. There's one scientist who believes that he can introduce Sigmund Freud into the mix. They will take a machine and they will train it to be psychiatrically aware, and they will train it to live or operate in an 8-hour period the way a human being would. In other words, the machine will be awakened at 7 o'clock in the morning, will be a little slow getting up, then will develop incentive. Energy electronic and chemical will flow through, and then there'll be a little letdown at lunch, and then it will start up in the afternoon, and then it'll get worried, it will go to sleep 8 hours later. Well, they're working on that kind of thing so that when they achieve the simulation of an actual humanoid machine, that it will be human in the same way humans are humans, looked at psychologically. Now, all of that kind of imagination and experiment has also produced many, many sinister possibilities. There is, of course, the age-old fear that a machine will get so smart. And as you know, there are very few computer scientists who don't believe that machines will be smarter than human beings. There's no question about that. Smarter in the sense of what it can do and how long it would take it to do. Not smarter in the sense of a kind of highly sensitive, intuitive human being working his way through a philosophical problem. Those kinds of things they're not worried about. They want to skip over that. There are what we call what is the emotional medical term? Neurological. There are neurological biologists, neurobiologists, who study the brain. And they have been working on this problem of how to duplicate or create anything that's comparable to what's going on up here in all of us. And there are, of course, scientists who say, we will never know what it is at the, somewhere in that brain, what provides the energy that sets the signals that go through the neurons and the synapses and create an action. We will never know. They took the brains of 10 pigs at Yale Medical School. 10 pigs. They brought in the heads of the pigs from the slaughterhouse. They put them on a bench or a table for 8 hours. And then they came and they took the brains out of the skull. They put the brains in dishes. And they pumped into the brains a fluid that was simulated blood and whatever else goes into the fluids in our head. Mine drips in the back of my throat, makes me cough. But whatever that is, they were able to simulate it. They pumped it in, and those pig brains were awakened. They've been a slaughtered beast, away from a slaughtered beast. They've been sitting on a table for 8 hours. But for a brief period, the energy, both electronic and chemical, that would have operated in that brain came alive. Great excitement. Went on the front pages all over the world. I get a lot of mail and bulletins from friends at the university who send me these things that, my gosh, they said there were 120 countries were calling to get information on it, doing this story. Well, you haven't heard anything since. That's another problem that is generic. It's called hype. One thing everybody who's observed this phenomenon that's going on, they agree on, is that there's too much hype. The news, because scientists are trying to raise money all the time, get grants, get some help in paying the cost of interviews, when they write a piece for the New York Times or what have you. So you get a lot of hype, and then the winter sets in, and it hasn't taken them anywhere. But that has always been the case, and probably always will be the case. Not every piece of research is going to become a telephone or a television set. But the hype has hurt some of the progress that's going on, because it has taken support away and raised doubts and so forth. But meanwhile, there is a steady drumbeat of research and discovery and movement forward. There's 5 words here: nuclear, pandemic, climate control, and artificial intelligence. This represents my personal view, but for what it's worth, of what kinds of, how shall I say, overwhelming events could make this world, the people of this world, come together in what could be called something of a world government. Because you need a world government to deal with a nuclear war. You need a world government to deal with virus. The pandemics of the future have been envisioned by some researchers as horrendous beyond our understanding and vaccine defense. There's a belief that our COVID is going to be around for a couple of more years at least. And the new variants coming up in the next few years, there's scientific proof, or shall I say evidence, that it could easily be beyond control and worse than anything we've had so far. There is a virus running around right now. You all know that. You're all wearing masks because of it. And that, the new variant is ahead of the vaccine. They do not know whether they can defend against it. And the question is, will it be severe enough to kill or to put people in the hospital, which it is doing? So all of that, pandemic, climate control, you don't need the madness of the human population on this planet not focusing on climate and on what it's doing to the world we live in. I mean, the idea that millions and millions of people are going to migrate from the warm countries up into the cooler countries, and what it'll do, think of what the refugees from Ukraine have done to Poland and Romania. Think about how lives have changed. And that's a microcosm. When it turns to macrocosm, we are going to need a world government. When I got out of college, there was a group formed by a half dozen very preppy, very pedigreed young men from very well-known New England families. And they formed a group that was going to create something called World Federalism. Do any of you remember that? World Federalism. A federalism would be independent countries, maintaining their culture and their traditions and so on, but being linked to one central authority. And if you don't have a central authority, how the devil are you going to stop a nuclear war or do anything about it? If you don't have a central authority, how are we ever going to suppress the formation of viruses? 7,500, 10,000 viruses a month are looked at in laboratories. 90% of them, 98% of them are harmless. But there's, even over 0.01%, it could wipe out thousands. If there was that 0.01% was a severe, dangerous virus, how are you going to deal with it if not everybody coming together to do so? Now you get down to artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence will be vital to any solution to any of these problems. And cancer, if cancer is ever cured or even half restrained, it'll be because artificial intelligence mechanism help with the research, like my eye. My eye problem could very possibly have taken years, and I would be blind. Artificial intelligence can cause all kinds of good things to happen. It can also cause misinformation and disinformation, which we get on social media. Artificial intelligence makes social media. When during the Trump 2016 election, the Russians spent, by their own confession, about $120,000 was all they had to spend to reach 126 million voters with concentrated misinformation. All they wanted to do was confuse and discourage 100 or 200,000 voters. They needed 70,000, and that's what they got. They got that, and maybe more. That was done with artificial intelligence. It gave them the research they needed on who to target, so they knew who to send it to. It gave them the capacity to make these things into little chatbots which flow through the system. And for instance, one of them just went wherever the name Clinton was. It automatically went to any reference to Clinton. And you know the reasons why. But this could go either way or any way. How is that going to be controlled without a world government? If you read the literature coming out of Europe, the idealism of the young scientists in Europe was awesome to me. I mean, reading it was like reading, you know, a kind of learned, sensitive philosopher. And these are scientists. They're writing philosophy. I want to read you what Ted Mark had to say about this. If you don't mind, I've got to use a marathon for this. The Future Life Institute, that's the title. I think I can do this. And this is so intriguing. He wrote, the goal of the Future Life Institute's goal was to make people think about the fact that technology was giving life the power either to flourish like never before or to self-destruct. The first meeting of that group decided that it was necessary they urgently review biotech, nuclear weapons, climate control, but they also agreed their first mission was to make sure that safety was at the heart of artificial intelligence research. That was the earliest rumination of this group that now runs a college at MIT, endowed for the purpose of artificial intelligence. And incidentally, that college at MIT has a curriculum that requires 50% of your time on the humanities and 50 on science. Brilliant thing for them to do. But anyway, the safety factor is, if you wanted to weaponize, automate weapons, you could easily do it. Putin allegedly has a group of robots in one of his missile fields that are fully armed and computerized, automated, to search, find, and kill any trespasser. And they can move 30 miles an hour. And this is intelligence that's been published. That is against all rules that these people are thinking about. The weaponizing factor is enormous because there is a new department in our government called Space. You probably have never heard of it. Very few people have. It's run by a general, and he's in charge of satellites and space stations and anything we do in outer space. And he said solemnly on Sunday afternoon to Fareed Zakaria, in an open statement, he said the Russians have sent up a missile that destroyed a satellite. And this is dreadful news, and it is irresponsible, because what it's doing is moving us closer to a war in space. Now, I can go on and on with this, because I've read an awful lot about it, but I'm not going to bore you with it. I just want to say that that simple fact I've just described, it might cause a war in space, is the end of civilization. I mean, we're talking about things that are imponderably fatal to civilization as we know it. So knowledge of it and understanding of it is vitally important. How am I doing on time? Is it after 3?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to conclude now, but I want to do it with a quick story. Democracy, which I dearly love and always have. I mean, as a kid, I always tell people about my little Boy Scout troop in South Orange, New Jersey. We all played football and baseball together, and at the end of the day, we would be coming home. At 5 o'clock in my neighborhood, there was a very wealthy man who had a large estate, 40 head of sheep, and 10 antique cars. And it was a joy to have him in the neighborhood because he loved children, and we could ride in the cars on Sunday. But anyway, this guy had a flagpole. It was like, I thought it was a mile high as a kid. It looked so enormous. And every day at 5 o'clock, his butler would go out and lower the flag. And we came, all of us, including the bullies and the ugly kids, we would all gather when the flag, that's a scout salute, 2-finger salute. And none of this was, we didn't feel affected, pretense. You know, we didn't feel embarrassed in the slightest. There was nothing sentimental about this. This was part of our life as citizens of this country. I believe that citizenship and the defense of democracy is absolutely essential to anything we've been talking about. So I want to just read you the concluding words of a man named Walker, who was the president of the Ford Foundation. And he wrote an editorial for the Times, which maybe some of you saw, called "America is Worth Saving." The fact that you can name it, he used that title is interesting in itself. And this is what he said at the end of his. I'm sorry. I simply can't see well. He must forgive me. I have macular and I can't do it. So I'll go to the second half of my concluding message. He speaks about the need for reconciliation, the need for new common ground. And it's very eloquently and brilliantly expressed. And he speaks of patriotism. And he talks about patriotism in a way that we just don't normally hear anymore, except from the far right. And they're not talking about patriotism. They're talking about white nationalism. I'm talking about a government of freedom and justice for everybody, whatever color, shape, or form, everybody. Here is the New Yorker cover. Did any of you get New Yorker this week?
Yes.
This is New Yorker. Two houses side by side, 2 brownstone houses. On the left, with a lot of gardening, a lot of growth in the front, and a hammock on the little porch. On the right, a very little gardening with an American flag and a little sign for veterans and a camera over the door. That's the white man. That's the black man. And this guy has a thing, Black Lives Matter. And in the middle, between the 2 houses, or where the wall comes together, 2 American flags. I don't know what the message really is, but I take the message of inclusiveness and of common ground. That's what Walker was talking about. So it reminded me to conclude my comments of my mother, who I admired enormously. She got out of college and went to law school when there were like 3 women in New York who went to law school, 1916. She graduated and joined the Navy as a judge advocate and her boss was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And she worked for a couple of years for the Navy and lived with a doctor and his wife on the third floor of a house near the Capitol. Well, she died in 1987. An event that I still remember. And about a year later, I come home to get some papers in Hamden, Deepwood Drive. I go into my house, there's nobody there. At that point, Joy was off at some meeting. And the bell rings, the front bell rings. That never happened. I go to the door, there is a captain in the Navy, standing there at attention. And with him is his driver to offer you this expression of gratitude from the President of the United States. And I took the box and I opened it up, and this is what was in it. I've never, this is my mother's flag and a citation expressing gratitude for service to the nation. I consider things like that a signal about who we are and what we ought to be and how we should love this country. I just never forget the feeling of holding that in my hand. So I think there are a lot of signals that we're starting to get about the fate of this country and the fate of democracy. And I just leave you with the thought, pay attention to those signals. Thank you.